Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening from wherever you're calling from. I'm Ian Gary. I'm the Executive Director of the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency, or FACT Coalition. We're excited that you've decided to join us for the U.S. launch of the Financial Secrecy Index, a report produced by the Tax Justice Network, ranking how much jurisdictions around the world allow their financial and legal systems to be used to hide and launder money. An estimated $10 trillion is held offshore beyond the rule of law. With global attention on finding and seizing Russian oligarch assets, it is now more urgent than ever to tackle the ability of dirty money to travel the world. Financial secrecy allows money laundering and tax evasion to flourish, starving treasuries both in the US and abroad. Unfortunately, for the first time, the US is now ranked as the most secretive jurisdiction in the world. This assessment is in line with Treasury Secretary Yellen's statement last December that the US is, quote, the best place to hide and launder ill-gotten gains. Not only does financial secrecy provide a route for authoritarians, kleptocrats, and their cronies to park assets in the US, this secrecy is responsible for costing the rest of the world an estimated $20 billion in lost tax revenue every year. The Biden administration and Congress have taken important steps to combat corruption and financial secrecy. Given the urgency of effectively sanctioning Russian oligarchs and these new findings released today, it's time, though, for the US to accelerate the reform timetable. Addressing financial secrecy and global corruption starts in the US by 1, addressing anonymous shell entities, 2, bringing greater transparency to the $50 trillion US real estate market and the $11 trillion private investment fund sector. 3, extending anti-money laundering obligations to professional enablers, such as lawyers, accountants, and corporate formation agents, who can grant access to the US financial system. And 4, engaging in more reciprocal exchange of tax information with partner jurisdictions. Right now, time is of the essence. Implementation of the landmark Corporate Transparency Act, which for the first time will require the identification of the true owners of anonymous shell companies, must be accelerated so that regulations are finalized by the end of this year. To achieve this aim, it is essential that the agency responsible for implementing the law, the U.S. Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, be fully funded. We understand that a $52 million boost to Treasury included in the House-passed Ukraine supplemental and awaiting Senate approval may be utilized in part to shore up perpetual underfunding of FinCEN. Congress must give FinCEN the funding it needs, including every penny of the $210.3 million requested by the Biden administration for FinCEN in 2023. To discuss the important implications of the US ranking #1, we are delighted to have a great lineup of speakers. We'll start with opening remarks by Representative Carolyn Maloney, Chairwoman of the House Oversight and Reform Committee. Representative Maloney is a congressional champion of financial transparency reform and co-author of the Corporate Transparency Act. We'll then turn to Alex Cobham, Executive Director of Tax Justice Network, to explain the Financial Secrecy Index results and the importance of US reforms. Finally, we'll be joined by Lakshmi Kumar, Policy Director of Global Financial Integrity, and Ryan Garul, FACT's Policy Director, to unpack the steps needed to reform financial secrecy in the US. Unfortunately, Representative Maloney could not be with us in person, so we have a statement from her office.
Hello, I'm Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney. Thank you so much for having me. I apologize I could not be there in person. Financial transparency is one of the most pressing national security issues we face in the United States. As you know, shell companies allow criminals, terrorists, and other bad actors to move money around the U.S. financial system and finance their operations freely. Unfortunately, evidence like the Financial Security Index released today shows the U.S. is one of the easiest places in the entire world to set up anonymous shell companies that are not required to disclose their true beneficial owners. This is going to change, however, with the implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act, which I am proud to have authored and to have gotten enacted into law in December 2020. This will be revolutionary to our financial system because it will allow law enforcement to access data on the true owners of anonymous shell companies that have been operating in the shadows for years. But before this can happen, FinCEN needs to issue rulemaking and begin implementing the law. I have urged both the Treasury and FinCEN to expedite this process that has been long delayed. In an April hearing with the Financial Services Committee, I pressed Secretary Yellen to work with FinCEN to prioritize this immediately. And last week, Congress passed legislation to provide critical funding to Ukraine, which included support for the Treasury to conduct anti-money laundering due diligence and impose sanctions on Russia. The $53 billion provided to the Treasury will go toward a variety of measures to target Russian money laundering, but I have privately and now publicly urged them to leverage this additional support to also implement this important law which will assist in their efforts. I am proud to have worked with you on this monumental piece of legislation, and I look forward to seeing this implemented. None of this would have happened without the support of professionals like yourselves. So I want to thank you for all of the work that you've been doing and the work that you continue to do in promoting this important effort. Thank you.
And we'd like to thank Representative Maloney for her tireless advocacy for financial transparency in the United States and her efforts to rid the U.S. financial system of dirty money. Now I'd like to turn it over to Alex Cobham, who is the Executive Director of the Tax Justice Network, to go into a bit more detail on the findings of this year's Financial Secrecy Index. Alex?
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here. The Financial Secrecy Index, we've been publishing every couple of years since 2009. What it does is it combines measures of secrecy. So do you have public information about who owns companies, other legal vehicles? Do you exchange information about who owns financial accounts? Do you cooperate internationally in the ways you should? Do you require appropriate transparency from multinational companies and others? All of that brought together, the law and the practice. Those secrecy measures, though, we combine with a scale measure to see, we're not just interested in very small jurisdictions that are secretive. We want to know who the big players are. And what that tells you is it isn't just, tax havens over there and everybody else are the good guys. There's a spectrum. Every country, every jurisdiction is more secretive than it might be and has work to do. But as you say, this time, what we found is that the US has gone to the top of the ranking, single-handedly actually giving it the biggest secrecy value that we've ever seen, responsible for about 5% of all the global secrecy threats that underpin tax abuse and corruption worldwide. Now, if you put the UK, the United Kingdom, and its dependent territories together, and in a sense, the UK makes law for all of them, so this is reasonable, they become twice as important as the United States. But when they're separated out the way we do, it's the US that sits on top. So there's very much an Anglo-American axis of financial secrecy that needs to be challenged. Globally, though, the pattern's a bit different. What we see is that, actually, if you take out the G7 countries for a moment, international financial transparency has actually improved since the 2020 index by about 5%. But that's cut in half, or actually worse than half, by the G7 countries, the US and the UK, but also Germany, France, Italy, and then Canada and Japan, which between them have been mainly going backwards at the same time as the rest of the world is making progress. So we have an issue here. But also perhaps a reason to be optimistic, and that's this. The G7 are leading the way on sanctions in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so suddenly, even if they didn't care about the effectiveness of their laws against corruption or dirty political finance, or even the effectiveness of their taxes, they do care about the effectiveness of their sanctions. So there's an opportunity now for consensus about ending the lawlessness of anonymous wealth and the financial secrecy that underpins it. As Ian has said, Treasury Secretary Yellen has identified already the US as effectively the biggest threat in terms of global financial secrecy. And President Biden has pledged to lead the global fight against illicit finance. I think people around the world are now looking and asking, what does that mean? We've heard from Representative Maloney, and we'll hear from other speakers about the domestic steps that the US can take and really must take, I think, with some urgency. But at the international level, there are perhaps two main elements that it would be great to see that leadership from President Biden. So one is the proposal for a global asset registry, joining up the different registers that exist, both public and private, to law enforcement, of the ultimate beneficial owners of companies, trusts and foundations, other legal vehicles, but also financial accounts and high value assets. That will allow law enforcement in different places to look through even the private data and understand exactly who is behind any given valuable asset, any bit of wealth. And some public information also to help civil society and journalists and the public generally hold people accountable. And then secondly, a UN tax convention to shift the rulemaking on both transparency and tax out of the OECD and the Financial Action Task Force that have demonstrably failed to give us the progress we need, and into a globally inclusive and more transparent setting at the United Nations, where perhaps finally we can see the kind of progress that's needed, and lower income countries that currently lose the greatest share of their tax revenues to tax abuse will also be fully represented. The US, which loses the biggest volume of tax in absolute terms, will itself be able to start clawing back some of that for the kind of public spending that's clearly needed in these difficult times. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I will now turn to Lakshmi Kumar, who is the Policy Director at Global Financial Integrity, to drill down on some of the reforms that are needed in the US context. Lakshmi.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Alex, for really providing us, I think, a really critical look at what's been happening in the US. And it's all the more relevant, the US becoming the #1 financial secrecy jurisdiction in the world at a time when the issues around illicit financial flows, the costs and consequences have really become part of the national conversation with the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. The issue primarily being with all of this is, as the US seeks to provide aid and investment in unprecedented amounts, as we speak, there's a $40 billion aid package that is trying to move its way through the Senate. And we have the president's commitment to really tackle authoritarianism and corruption and illicit finance, while at the same time making it a part of the White House strategy. We also see that the US continues to be an easy way to get around the very sanctions that we are putting in place. So there is a contradiction in terms here, that all this money and investment that is being put towards tracking down illicit assets is only meaningful if the US has measures in place to actually prevent the US itself being a home to sanction evaders, authoritarian regimes, transnational criminal organizations. And going back to sort of the point that Alex and Ian were making, the acknowledgement that we are the #1 destination to launder money is significant, because there is a reputational benefit that the US provides when you're able to house illicit wealth here. And which is why when we talk about areas for reform, it is important to understand that despite the US having passed legislation to implement the Corporate Transparency Act, it is not yet law. The recent Treasury assessment of where it sees this going really sees this only becoming law in 2024. And within the CTA, there are over 23 exemptions, some of them critical, which would make any future law, unless they were sufficiently narrowed down, ripe for abuse. two of which, I think three of which that are worthwhile discussing are the exemptions that are provided to for-profit companies that essentially make $5 million in revenue or receipts, sales and receipts, which also have 20 employees. Now, unless this exemption was really, really narrowed down, it would become very easy to continue to launder money through assets in the US, because then a whole host of companies would just never be part of supervision and oversight. Now, the same thing goes to trusts. The US Corporate Transparency Act language doesn't specifically mention trust, but there is a strong opportunity for us to include it as part of how we think about other similar entities. Now, unless both trusts and for-profit companies are tackled in a future rulemaking, it would make for an ineffective registry if both of them were ultimately excluded from the registry and the final regulation surrounding the CTA. Now, on the one hand, we have sort of the CTA position, but the gaping areas for reform in comparison to the G7 are a lot more. You have the CTA. In addition to that, there is the whole issue of private investment funds. As recent news stories surrounding Russia have shown, that there's over $1 billion that Roman Abramovich managed to invest in US hedge funds. Now, the issue being that in the US, this is a $11 trillion industry, which is firstly, currently exempt from beneficial ownership requirements under the CTA. Two, there is no requirement ongoing that they have to conduct AML due diligence. So really, as we go back to the narrative of what we can do to sort of mitigate against national security risks, this becomes another critical piece, because the truth is that with private investment funds, while imperfect, many other jurisdictions do, at a minimum, at least have laws in place. And the last two pieces that I realize are critical areas of reform the administration is committed to, that is something that in the future would be good to assess as we see these for the supply of how the US acts as a supplier of illicit finance, are the issues of real estate and gatekeepers. Real estate, as you know, GFI's own report showed, is a big magnet. We were able to track over 26 countries investing illicit money into the real estate sector. Again, in light of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis, everywhere you look, what you are able to see is authoritarian oligarchs, kleptocrats investing money in assets like real estate, yachts, horses, and really prioritizing the commitment and actually having a fulsome national rule, not just another renewal of the G2, is critical. And I think finally, when we talk about the issue of gatekeepers, it's systemic, it is global, it covers the entire world. And there is no country, while they have laws, have actually successfully implemented it. Now, in the US case, there is no legal framework to tackle the issue of gatekeepers, because gatekeepers, when we talk about the ultimate ways in which secrecy takes place and the US becomes a safe haven of financial secrecy, it moves through gatekeepers, it moves to lawyers, accountants, it moves to professionals that know the rules. And so while really sort of tackling these four planks is critical, both to sort of influence the agenda in the US and mitigate against the threats that the US face as a safe haven for illicit money globally, is worthwhile. And more importantly, there is this knock-on effect where tackling gatekeepers, tackling some of these sectors has an impact in the overall environment in which there is not so much carte blanche, where illicit actors feel that there are no rules, there is nothing to stop them from investing in the US. Thank you. I'm going to hand it back to Ian and Ryan for their remarks.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi. I'll now turn it over to Ryan Garul, who is the policy director at the FACT Coalition. I think the Financial Secrecy Index, as we've discussed, is an important research product that illuminates the problems that are caused by financial secrecy, both in terms of enabling global corruption and money laundering, but also in terms of enabling tax evasion and tax avoidance. And so, Ryan, could you speak to how greater exchange of information and tax transparency could address some of the problems highlighted in this new report?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ian. This FSI ranking confirms that the United States, once a leader in tax transparency efforts, is now approaching monopolistic power in financial secrecy that enables international tax fraud, tax evasion, and other tax avoidance. The US can clean up its act by finally engaging in real automatic information exchange with other tax authorities and advancing public country-by-country reporting for large multinational companies. Pursuant to the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA, which is meant to crack down on offshore tax evasion by wealthy Americans, the US requires foreign financial institutions to conduct diligence and share data on financial accounts held directly or indirectly by US taxpayers with the IRS. Information is shared with the IRS directly or through host governments under FATCA bilateral agreements on an automatic basis. In exchange for the information provided pursuant to the bilateral information exchange agreements, however, the US provides foreign governments with basically nothing. In contrast, much of the rest of the OECD actually engages in automatic and reciprocal information sharing with respect to offshore financial accounts under the Common Reporting Standard, including those held via legal entities. Studies have confirmed that FATCA and the subsequent adoption of CRS by the OECD have had one very profound effect. Cross-border deposits in US financial institutions have increased dramatically. In the last decade, since FATCA was introduced and began to dismantle secrecy afforded by traditional tax havens like Switzerland, it is no coincidence that known human rights abusers, drug traffickers, and Russian oligarchs have all moved their assets to US-based trusts, as revealed by the recent blockbuster Pandora Papers. President Biden's 2023 budget request includes reforms necessary to allow the US to engage in more reciprocal and automatic information exchange under FATCA, including with respect to digital assets, an emerging trend also being considered by the OECD. These reforms should be advanced, and international best practices with respect to information exchange, like those contemplated in the amended Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters, should be taken into account in seeing these reforms through. According to TJN, or Tax Justice Network, if the US were to adopt similar reforms, it would cut its supply of financial secrecy to the world by 40% and drop to third on the index, below Switzerland and Singapore. The US also enables financial secrecy by continuing to allow its large multinational companies to consume exported financial secrecy in more traditional tax havens. To delegitimize systems of financial secrecy that contribute to and enrich corruption, the US should also require large multinational companies to publicly disclose key financial metrics, like related party revenues and taxes paid, for each jurisdiction in which they operate. Applicable companies already report this information to the IRS on a confidential basis, but standardizing public disclosure of this information would allow investors and other users of financial statements, such as policymakers, to assess financial, geopolitical, and other risks stemming from offshore practices, including the aggressive tax planning strategies implemented by certain multinational companies. Growing US investor and stakeholder momentum to see this information should be met by regulatory action from the SEC. Public reporting is another benefit. It actually addresses the often one-sided benefits of transparency reforms in light of the harms of capital flight from resource-constrained nations or authoritarian nations or corrupt nations that may be better served by direct public access to information. For example, public reporting related to beneficial ownership of non-financial assets, which are gaps in FATCA and CRS, as well as public country-by-country reporting for multinational companies, can obviously save costs relating to automatic exchange infrastructure. It can also increase public accountability for kleptocrats, oligarchs, or other politically exposed persons, and even large companies. Enabling corrupt or tax-dodging actors to secretly invest their often illicit financial gains only legitimizes and empowers these actors and these systems. The US should cement its position as a champion of open and free markets and as the protector of global democracies by reclaiming its role as a leader in tax transparency and by enacting critical complementary corporate transparency reforms like those highlighted by Lakshmi and Chairwoman Maloney. I look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Just to let our participants know that you can use the Q&A function to ask questions of any of the panelists. So please submit your questions now. I will start with maybe a question for all of the panelists if you want to answer it. There's sort of a contradiction between the fact that the US is now #1 on this Financial Secrecy Index, and all of the positives we've seen coming out of the Biden administration in terms of the national strategy to counter corruption, various rulemakings that are underway. So what do you owe this sort of disconnect between this ranking and all of the positive actions that we see from the Biden administration?
Do you want to jump in, Alex, or do you want me to take a first step?
Well, perhaps I think you US-focused panelists should take more, but a quick reflection from outside. When I think you could say, on the one hand, it's just because the base was so low. They've made progress, but they had such a bad starting place that there's just a long way to go before it's more fully reflected. Alternatively, you could think that they're addressing relatively useful domestic issues, but it isn't really yet getting to grips with the problems that make the US attractive as a haven for people in other countries. I suspect a bit of both of those is true, but I'd very much like to hear Ryan and Lakshmi's view.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Alex. I think, when you think about it, you never want to play from your back foot, is kind of a common expression that there is. And I think the situation in Russia and Ukraine really is demonstrating that the US is now caught on its back feet, as well as many of our allies, in addressing some of these more systemic corruption issues. Trying to levy sanctions and not knowing who and where owns assets in your own country is an inherently problematic thing. And now we see FinCEN and other agencies, including those engaged in a transnational cooperative effort to levy these sanctions, really trying to play off their heels. I think as we're starting to get a better sense of how to deal with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's been very evident that what needs to happen is that these agencies are more supported, given the resources that they need to not only address sanctions in real time and help create an effective policy that way, but also to then implement these systemic reforms that we've all been talking about for a number of years. And to do that, as Ian mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, in the US in particular, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which has been perpetually underfunded, needs resources, both from a staffing perspective, but also to set up the technological infrastructure that's going to be necessary to engage in best data practices with respect to implementing the Corporate Transparency Act, for example. That law, as much as it is a transparency law, is a data law. It is imperative that data is correctly collected, verified upon collection, and capable of being used interoperably with different systems, because sharing that information is a key component of that bill. Otherwise, it's kind of a useless set of information that we're gathering. So from those perspectives, every cent of the $210.3 million that President Biden requested for FinCEN in his most recent budget request has to be delivered to FinCEN. FinCEN did not get the funds that it was hoping for in entirety in the last budget request and appropriation session. And now there are efforts in Congress to advance additional funds to kind of fill that little bit of gap that was there from the last session. But going forward, FinCEN must be funded so that it can staff and invest appropriately to carry out these systemic reforms.
Thanks, Ryan. Lakshmi?
No, I'll just quickly add, not to take up more time, because I realize there are others that may have questions. But what I will say, and is on the whole, what we've also seen in the US is the president has made a real commitment, President Biden, in tackling what he sees as key areas of vulnerability. While that is true, what is also true at the same time is the reform. It is one thing to make a commitment. It is a different thing for it to see it in practice. And I think that's where the gap is really in our case, is that we have made all these commitments. The fight to get beneficial ownership passed was a 10-year fight in the US. We still don't have implementing regulations. While so we have a real commitment and a law, we don't have implementing regulations. And still, till that comes into effect, the problem doesn't go away. And if the safest place to hide your money is is near the gatekeepers themselves, then why won't you choose to do that? And I think that's something that we really are seeing as a recurring trend. For example, as we talk about $11 trillion private investment, Treasury's latest assessment, as it says, it's going to take till 2024 that's their timeline to have the CTA and beneficial ownership implemented, to have maybe a rule on real estate. So that's another 2 years that we still have to wait. And we don't know what real estate will cover. And then with something like the investments side, which is investment vehicles, there's the assessment in the Treasury report says, is this something that is actually a threat? It still leaves it as a question mark. And so we have the commitment, but on the other hand, we also see we really need to make strides on the implementation side of it. And I won't talk about, if we talk about the global architecture and all of this, FATF's recent effectiveness report shows only 52% of countries actually have effective beneficial ownership standards. So, I mean, I think that gives you a sense of not just the US problem, but systemically why this is a global problem.
Great, thanks. We started to get in some questions, and I think one of them you just answered, Lakshmi, is around the Corporate Transparency Act and the timeline for implementation. So the latest that we've seen from Treasury is that their strategy on dealing with illicit finance and terrorist financing came out on Friday, and they have language in that strategy about a final rule by 2024. It's not entirely clear whether that means that the rule would be effective in 2024 or that the final rule will be promulgated. What do you think is a reasonable but necessary timeline for implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act?
I think if we had it our way, we would get, as Treasury and FinCEN have said, the rulemaking is going to occur in 3 phases. We've done phase 1 of it now. I think phase 2 is the question of access. And then finally, when we're looking at verification of all this information, I think to really hit the targets that we want to hit, we should try and complete all 3 phases of this rulemaking within the course of this year, so that we really are setting up it to meet the targets of 2024. I think if we can realistically move, the government has always known as soon as CTA passed, and the hope is that they've already started talking to providers, because there's the one thing, the regulation, but I think something that we aren't necessarily in the know about is if conversations have taken place to actually decide how the nuts and bolts of the registry, what it will look like, what the data architecture is going to look like as they figure it out. However, if the plan is the regulation gets done and then we start talking about how to build the registry, then I think that's a bigger concern. So I would say that we should get the rulemaking done within the 3 phases of it, at least published and done by the end of this year. So it really sets us up to hopefully not meet the target at the end of 2024, so that it's technically 2025, but really the end of 2023. So we go into the start of 2024 with an actual registry.
Thanks, Lakshmi. And I think it's important to bear in mind that the US is organizing some high-profile moments at the end of this year, including hosting the International Anti-Corruption Conference, as well as a second Summit for Democracy. Given the fact that the first summit in December last year highlighted the struggle against corruption, I think it would be problematic for the US to host a second summit without the Corporate Transparency Act final rules in place. Turn to Ryan. I think you're muted, Ryan.
Oh, thank you. I completely agree. Thanks for flagging that event as a key moment for finalizing regulations, so that, as Lakshmi said, this registry can be effective, at the end of 2023, beginning 2024 at the latest. Just to touch on that just a little bit further, and a point Lakshmi was making, that means that FinCEN should be working on the directory currently. It's not enough for them to just implement rules by the end of 2023 and then try to get everything in place in the next so many months. It's very clear that FinCEN is going to have a central directory, and they should be taking the steps necessary to build that directory with current resources and additional resources that civil society is advocating that FinCEN receive, as well as to make sure that in the next rulemaking, which covers access, they clearly lay out the plan for that so that folks can weigh in, and that registry and the coordination with folks like state authorities and secretaries of state that are going to be necessary to implement those rules effectively are engaged in the process, and everything goes smoothly without a hitch so that they are ready to get things registered from an informational perspective by January 1st, 2024 at the latest.
Thanks, Ryan. We received a question. The question is there any rough estimate of how much money is being anonymously stashed in the US through shell companies? And I think that gets to the issue that has been flagged in terms of the US ranking in terms of supplying financial secrecy. I don't know if Alex or Ryan or Lakshmi, you want to tackle that specific question, or more broadly, how much illicit money is in the US?
Others may know of an estimate that's been made, but as far as I'm aware, there isn't something beyond the kind of estimates we have in the state of tax justice around the scale of offshore money being hidden in the US. But that doesn't tell you about the particular role of shell companies. In a sense, the problem is, ultimately, you won't know how big the problem is until you've fixed it. And this is true in most of these areas of financial secrecy. It's only at the stage when you finally put through the legislation and enforced it to get the data that you need that you understand how big the problem was before you did that. So whether it's through shell companies or foundations, or it's shell companies in other jurisdictions holding financial accounts in the US, for example, or real estate, these are all elements of the same problem that deny the US tax revenues and other countries, but also propagate corruption in the US and all around the world. Putting numbers on the specifics of a particular channel is difficult, but I don't know. Others may have heard more research on that.
The Treasury has put out a number in different reports throughout the years that's kind of consistent with 2% of GDP is the estimated amount of illicit financial flows that might move through the U.S. economy every year. And Vladimir Putin doesn't have a bank account with Bank of America, so most of that is assumedly done through secretive shell entities of some sort, anonymous legal entities or arrangements or nominees or other vehicles along those lines. That's an astronomical number, by the way. The U.S. GDP is a pretty big number, thankfully. So I think that's kind of one of the few official estimates that we've seen.
Lakshmi, anything on this question?
No estimates, but I will make a small plug, which is to say, as we did a small report which showed that in the US it is easier to set up a company than it is to get a library card at your local public library. I think that really puts it in perspective. But what I will tell you is, going back to previous assessments, we have seen that the US government has sometimes had to abandon cases where the money that was being laundered was $86 million. Just because it is too hard to get beneficial ownership information. So this is not even trying to estimate how much money this is. This is knowing that $86 million is being laundered, but you can't always go after it because it is so hard, and the challenges to get to that information are insurmountable. We've seen, and I think the truth is, what we see is when you see piecemeal examples. So for example, when you see that the Iranian government is able to own a skyscraper through an anonymous company that's worth somewhere around, and when you start adding, it's close to like $500 million. That tells you, the piecemeal examples tell you the size and scale of the problem, because that's just the tip of the iceberg. And that's what we try to use to move the issue in the agenda forward. I don't think there's really any country that can accurately tell you how much money is hidden in anonymous companies anyway, unfortunately.
I think one question I have for Ryan is that the Financial Secrecy Index ranks countries with vastly different political systems. In the US, we have a federal system, and states are able to put forward their own regulations that may contribute to financial secrecy. Could you talk a bit about how federalism comes into play in terms of financial secrecy, and any signs of potential reforms at the state level?
Absolutely. And, it's one of those maxims that you hear kind of in your first year, like corporate law class in law school, is that there's no such thing as federal corporate law. It all gets done at the state level for the most part. And kind of a little bit of an irony is now the Corporate Transparency Act is one of the few rules that will change that a bit in terms of trying to standardize formation practices and the information gathering that is accrued in connection with doing so. But by and large, each of the 50 states gets to set its own rules around formation practices, how entities are governed, and how different entities might have different levels of secrecy, whether it be based on reporting or otherwise. And that includes trusts as an arrangement, or partnerships, limited partnerships, corporations, limited liability companies, all the different vehicles that we might be concerned about. And the banks themselves also play a role in regulating financial institutions like different trust agencies and otherwise. As it relates to different state efforts, the Corporate Transparency Act is going to, for example, require registration of all the entities, corporations, limited liability companies, and we assume limited partnerships, as indicated in the proposed regulations, that file with the Secretary of State or similar office in connection with formation. But a question arises as to whether what happens if state law doesn't require an entity to file in connection with formation, for example. And this is where it's so important for many common law trusts or other state trust law foundations to really begin to incorporate the ways that they might address financial secrecy in their own jurisdiction. And we've seen exciting movement around this. Traditional secrecy havens like Alaska, for example, has proposed a bill that would require Alaskan trusts to identify their beneficial owners to the equivalent of the Secretary of State in Alaska. That would close a huge door in the Corporate Transparency Act, and it would also be a great example of the way that states can use federalism to compete to encourage transparency and improve positive market externalities for its citizenry as well. Similarly, the Corporate Transparency Act isn't necessarily going to cover every single thing, and as Lakshmi mentioned, there are problematic exemptions potentially. The state of New York is considering a bill right now, which we understand has a decent shot in the state legislature, that will require limited liability companies, a particularly problematic set of anonymous entities in New York historically, to register their beneficial owners with the Secretary of State. And this also addresses questions around access. Proposed rules for access have not been issued yet under the CTA. But if the states themselves piggyback off CTA reforms and collect information with minimal costs for folks filing, then the states can guarantee their own access to this information and share it in an administratively feasible way to ensure that this information most benefits the folks within their own state and communities. This is a really exciting change. The last thing I'll say about the New York bill in particular is that it is contemplating a public registry for the first time. Now, that portion of the bill we understand will now be introduced more seriously in a later session of the New York legislature. But creating public registries, as we've discussed in our different portions of our stated testimony, is critical to bringing greater transparency and verification of information across different government databases to light, both for the US and our communities, as well as those international and interstate efforts that are so necessary to address these types of corruption risks.
Thanks, Ryan. We have a question from David Luna. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, has created the kleptocrats task force to combat oligarchs regarding Russia and financing its war in Ukraine. Should the National Security Council have a unified strategy and interagency task force to also prosecute illicit finance, trade-based money laundering, and threat finance to target kleptocrats, cartels, counterfeiters, terrorists, and other threat networks? Lakshmi, Ryan, do you have any thoughts on that particular question? And maybe more broadly, all the focus right now is on Russia. How can we adapt our systems in the US to go after oligarchs and kleptocrats wherever they reside?
No, what I will say with as regards the ideas, the Russia-Ukraine situation has provided us an opportunity at a really critical juncture to actually do something about this. It's always been known that kleptocrats and oligarchs or authoritarian figures, their family members, invest money but this is an opportunity to build off of that. So to ensure that this is not just a one-time effort, but really this is part of more systemic change in the US, but more broadly, in a lot of the large financial centers of the world, this recognition that part of the problem, you can't try and deal with the problem when the chickens have come home to roost. You really have to deal with the problem prior to that. And while we are dealing with the Russia-Ukraine, we don't want to see the next version of Russia-Ukraine. And that's what I think more forward thinking about this issue is relevant. Now, what I will say is and I think David's question is absolutely right. A lot of the work is siloed. The one thing that's also true with a lot of this work is that, and this is part of, as the US is going into its own FATF assessment in the next couple of years, is that a lot of the work around illicit finance and money laundering is concentrated at the federal level. There is very little work actually done at the state level where, and I think trying to sort of bridge that in a country as large as the US, where federalism is in play, is really critical to taking on this issue head on, is to make sure that knowing that not everything can and will be done at the federal government level, it's going to have to devolve, and you're going to have to educate and equip state level law enforcement to sort of really pursue and understand and put together why this is critical. And that really is then talking about a change in attitudes in South Dakota, Wyoming, about money that is coming into the state. What is good business for the state? Good business for the state doesn't mean necessarily good business for the country. And so I think really trying to sort of put those pieces together is important. I will say on the last point on this is I think it is any way we can get government agencies to talk together is the better. I think thinking through about, I think balancing out kleptocrats, cartels, organized crime, counterfeiters, then I think the problem is when you have too many issues, then there's an issue of, as they say in government agencies, the problem of how to rack and stack. What becomes the priority? And I think if we agree that corruption is the priority, then I think maybe sort of having that one issue item as the priority is something that you can build agencies around, as opposed to having multiple issues. But that would just be my thoughts. I'm happy to hear what others think about it.
Ryan, anything on this point?
I think that's largely correct. I think it takes a village to catch a kleptocrat, so to speak. And I think one thing that we've seen historically in different beneficial ownership registries that have already been put in place, for example, is that there have been data collection and verification problems, for example. And this is an area where it's really important to have collaboration and shows the synergies that are created by making sure there's a consistent information exchange across different intergovernmental agencies within the US, intergovernmental agencies as it relates to our federalist system, and international interoperability of information sharing as well. That touches on different key points with respect to the laws themselves and the agencies themselves working together, but also data verification mechanisms, standardized data practices, and other data sharing practices that are also necessary to consider in all of these circumstances as well. So, yeah.
We received another question which recognizes that we've highlighted real estate and private investment, private equity as areas of concern when it comes to money laundering and corruption in the US financial system. With real estate, we've seen that the Biden administration and the Treasury Department have started a formal rulemaking to create a nationwide and permanent regime to deal with money laundering through real estate. We are not sure what form that will take and what a final rule would look like, but there is certainly recognition by the Biden administration that this is a serious issue that needs to be dealt with. On the other hand, with private investment, which is a complex, opaque and massive industry, we've not seen that kind of definitive recognition that this is a threat. In December, the FACT Coalition, along with our partners, Transparency International and Global Financial Integrity, issued a report called Private Investment, Public Harms, outlining the risks. I'm wondering, Lakshmi, could you spend a little more time on why we think the private investment sector is so important and that desperately needs addressing?
No, absolutely. One, it's the sheer size of it. It is $11 trillion of absolutely unregulated money that no one's asking anyone any questions about. It's $11 trillion is bigger than the GDP of a lot of countries. That should be your reference point. Like many other issues that we've seen time and again, whether it's with beneficial ownership or real estate, the US continues to lag behind many of its allies. By no means am I saying that what's happening in the EU is perfect, or what's happening in sort of the larger Asian economies is perfect. But I think the difference is they have their chess pieces on the board, which means it's that much easier than to think about enforcement and effectiveness and what works. And the problem that we have in the US is we still have nothing. And so we're really at a point, as we have seen, you're going from making the case to putting down legislation to then implementing legislation. We're still with the private investment sector really making the case. And there are, and this is despite us seeing, even in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, how much money, Abramovich held over $1 billion in the US through private investment vehicles. And I think our cases have shown that what we did is compile a series of cases is whether you were and it's both sort of, we see really oligarchs, drug traffickers, Ponzi scheme artists, no matter who you are, there's this notion that if you're a money launderer, you're not always using a sophisticated financial vehicle to launder your money. And that's not true. The truth is that almost everyone we've put together, whether you're a politician, whether you're a drug lord, whether you're an organized crime, all of them look at their business operations, their illicit activity as business operations. You want to see the longevity of your wealth. And what better place to hide it than in vehicles that have little scrutiny? Because the constant pushback that we have gotten is that, oh, you have to lock in this money. If you're a money launderer, you don't want to lock your money in for an extended period of time. And that is simply not true. So on the one hand, we are seeing examples. Again, these are piecemeal examples of individuals that are hiding money in this. We've seen Mexican drug cartels set up private investment accounts. We've seen Russian oligarchs. But on the other hand, we're also seeing that they're using these same entities to infiltrate and buy critical US national security assets through the use of private investment vehicles. And we've seen Chinese state government entities do this. We've seen Russian oligarchs. Very notable example is a Russian oligarch that was behind a private equity fund that was responsible for the state of Maryland's voting machines, which the state of Maryland was not unaware of. And I think that's the kind of dynamic that we really work with. We have seen Ruja Ignatova, the largest Ponzi scam artist in the world, has defrauded, whether it's in the US, Middle East, Africa, Asia. She's defrauded almost the vulnerable populations across the globe, but she had her lawyer in the US set up an account where he essentially earned a commission of $40 million for helping. So the examples are piecemeal. And on top of it, we've also had the leaked report of the FBI saying that they see this as a high-risk vulnerability. I think what we do lack, and this is a consistent problem, is there is no uniform data. And it's sort of like a chicken and egg situation we're in. There is no data, so that we can't make the case. And then the argument is that there is no risk because there is no data. So unless you actually begin the process of collecting and assessing and putting together information, you will see the extent of the risk. But the examples that we've collected, which is within a fairly short time, shows you when the risk does emerge, it is high value and high risk. And I think that should motivate. But if not, I think it's important for us to sort of really understand what is it that will change that relationship to move it from, is this a question of risk, to being able to assess this is a risk, while at the same time you have the Biden administration acknowledging this is a risk. You have the Treasury's own assessment still questioning it's a risk. And so I think trying to understand is what more is needed to move it across that line is critical, especially because given the size of the US economy, it seems worrying to say that the rest of the world where legislation is in place acknowledges this is a risk, including FATF assessments. But in the US, we continue to try and assess this, if this is even a risk in the face of evidence that we see continuing to build up to show how much of a risk the sector is.
Before we close, I want to ask Alex a couple of questions. And I think one is that I think sometimes you'll hear from a very sort of a morals-free and values-free perspective that this is a, financial secrecy is a business. It creates jobs. And if, say, the UK and US clean up their act, this money is just going to go to Dubai or some jurisdiction where there's seemingly no hope for reform. How would you respond to that kind of approach? And then two, you mentioned that the US and the UK have an unfortunate, in terms of the special relationship, have an unfortunate sort of axis of financial secrecy. But we've seen this year, in light of the Russian invasion, that there is some progress happening in the parliament, economic crimes legislation. How optimistic are you that in the UK there will be real reforms and potentially reforms the US should implement?
Great questions, thank you. Look, in terms of this argument that you might want as a state or a jurisdiction to make your economy better by selling financial secrecy, you only need to look, at the British Virgin Islands for a current example of what that does. When a state becomes heavily dependent on finance, what we call the finance curse kicks in. Now, you can see that most clearly in very small jurisdictions that are completely dominated by finance. And that does everything like, for example, if the Tax Justice Network kind of started in the little island of Jersey, instigated by people who felt like it was destroying their island. And it was, it had destroyed agriculture, pushed that out, destroyed tourism, made it too expensive. What was left was financial services. You either worked in that or you moved, you left the island that you were born on. And what was left was effectively corrupted because financial services had to be given the right to set the legislation in order to keep Jersey competitive, because it's a moving, it doesn't stop. You have to keep being the most secretive, the one at the bottom to keep that type of business going. And so your democracy suffers inevitably. So you could do that. It's a path. You can follow it for a while, but where it ends is where the British Virgin Islands is now, subject of a commission of inquiry in the UK that's just recommended that self-rule be suspended for 2 years so they can address the corruption. And while that was going on, the Prime Minister was arrested in the United States for alleged involvement in laundering the proceeds of drug trafficking. I mean, that's what selling financial secrecy eventually does, even to a bigger economy like the UK, which is estimated to have lost something like 4 trillion, I think, in GDP because of the damage that excessive finance does to the economy. This isn't a win for anyone. And even the growth that you do get is highly unequal and actually not very good for things like life expectancy and people's well-being. So what's the path out? And particularly for the UK and its many dependent territories that it pushed down this road about 50 years ago, and for the US, where you have states competing still to sell this stuff. I think it's hard because you get dug into it politically. And what we're seeing in the UK right now is this coming to a bit of a head. So we have an economic crime bill that the government had tried to drop until, effectively the corruption of things like their COVID procurement became so well exposed by the media that they were forced to say, no, we will do something about this. We do care about the rule of law, at least a bit. And now there's an opportunity for, all sorts of opposition groups and civil society putting forward a manifesto, an alternative economic crimes bill, if you like, that really would sort out a lot of these issues, dealing with beneficial ownership, transparency in particular, but also a lot of the enforcement questions that have been allowed to fester. But it's difficult. There's no silver bullet once you have become, as in a sense, dependent on financial services and particularly financial secrecy. So it's a long road. That doesn't mean we shouldn't start. We absolutely must. And the UK has to begin to pull itself back towards a respect for the rule of law. But it's not a one-year legislation scheme. It is a long road. And I think that goes back to, just to finish the point we talked about with the US, the Biden administration has done lots of good things. Why isn't the US looking better? because it's a long road. There is a lot to do, and it's a road that's very much worth traveling, and should be supported, but it will take time, and we need to recognize that.
Thanks, Alex. So we're at the top of the hour. Any final comments from Lakshmi or Ryan?
No, thanks everybody for having us. I think that the need for these regulations and the reform is self-evident, especially made so by the tragic events occurring in Ukraine right now. And I think that the path is clear. We just have to keep going down it. So.
No, just thank you to Alex and the work that Tax Justice Network is doing. I think they're at a critical juncture, and I think as Ian has said this in other places. I think as the war drags on, we will see it fall out of the news cycle. And I think to find ways to show why this is relevant and why the financial piece of this is really critical to tackling this problem and future problems is valuable. And I think this is yet again another opportunity, and the Financial Secrecy Index is yet again a new opportunity for us to show the relevance of what's going on to the work that we're doing and the need for really financial sector transparency and tax reform. So thank you for having been a part of this, and congratulations again to TJ and to FACT for hosting this.
Yes, I wanted to close by thanking TJN for producing the Financial Secrecy Index. It's a valuable and in-depth resource. Please visit the website to look in on all the data. US often says it's number one, and this is not something that we want to be number one in. So we have our work cut out for us in the FACT Coalition to clean up this financial secrecy and clean up dirty money out of our system. Really appreciate the contributions by Lakshmi and Ryan, as well as Representative Maloney, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks, everyone.
Many thanks. Bye.